Thank you so much for giving us this opportunity to talk with you about our research on how organizations build, lose, and regain trust. You can see me on the screen now with my co-author, Shalene Gupta, and we are delighted to be here and talking with you about these ideas. So the key to getting this right is first understanding what trust is and how it works. So that's the job that Shalene and I have today. After that, we turn it over to you to do the work you do with your own organizations and with your clients to try to help them become more trusted in whatever it is that they do. So thanks so much for having us, and we're delighted to get started. So I think that to understand how trust works, it helps to think about a couple of very basic ideas. So here you see three different principles of trust. And what I'm going to start doing is just to break these down, explain them to you, and then Shalene is going to come in and start doing her part of the presentation, and we'll be alternating back and forth as we did when we wrote the book together over many years. So thank you again. So the first principle of trust is that trust is vulnerability to the actions and intentions of others. And so in order to, let me start by breaking that down. Usually we think of trust in the personal sense, meaning are we talking about whether or not you are trustworthy as individuals? But that's not really what we're talking about here. When you think about trust in the organizational context, building trust in organizations requires that we start from the standpoint of the other person. And so when we say that trust is vulnerability, what we mean is it's that person's vulnerability to the organization that we're actually going to be focusing on. So reasonable people would then ask, well, what are they so vulnerable to? And they're vulnerable because they are counting on organizations to do things that they can't do for themselves. So let me frame this for you in the context of COVID. This is a terrible situation that all countries, communities, organizations are dealing with right now to try to help themselves get in front of and hopefully get this terrible pandemic under control. So what does vulnerability look like? We know that we can't, we're vulnerable because we can't create an effective vaccine for ourselves. We're counting on an organization to create a vaccine that works and that's effective against this pandemic. And so we're trusting on that sense in the actions of the organization. We're also trusting on their good intentions, which is that they actually care about us and they want to create a vaccine that works. So that's the first part of trust. It's vulnerability, the other person's vulnerability to the actions of others. The second principle of trust is that trust is limited. So we're trusting a company to create an effective vaccine, but that's all that we're trusting them to do. In this sense, trust is limited, and it's really a three-part relationship. There's the person who's doing the trusting, there's the organization they're trusting, and there's the thing they're trusting that organization to do. Now, if you're in business, this actually is a really helpful notion because it means whether you're thinking about trust within your organization as PR firms or with your clients, there are specific points in time where they're asking you to perform a service and they're trusting you to perform that service. That's when trust is being activated. It's at that moment of engagement between you and the individual or the company that's relying on you. Now, the third principle of trust is that trust is built from the inside out. When you think of all of the hands that the vaccine goes through, from inception through manufacturing to distribution, you want all of the people who are engaged in that process to be alert, to not be ill, to be well taken care of, and to care about the organization and the work that it does. And so in that sense, what we've found in the companies we've looked at is it's pretty much impossible to be trusted by people outside your organization if you're not trusted by people from inside. And so these are the three basic principles of trust. It's vulnerability, it's limited, and it's built from the inside out. So Shalene, why don't you talk with people about why it's a good idea to go after this trust goal?
Trust isn't just an airy-fairy concept. It has a real and tangible impact on performance. So first of all, trust delivers a strategic advantage. In a study of 30 NCAA basketball teams, researchers found that the teams with the most trust in their coach won the most amount of games. 7%, in fact, was correlated to an increase in trust. And the team with the most amount of trust in their coach won the most number of games. And the team with the lowest trust score only won 10% of their games that season. Now, the researchers interviewed teammates on the team that had the most trust in their coach to find out what was going on. One of the players commented, "Once we developed trust in coach, the progress we made increased tremendously because we were no longer asking questions or were apprehensive. Instead, we were buying in and believing that if we worked our hardest, we were going to get there." And now when you take that performance and strategic advantage and translate that into a business, there's a revenue advantage. In a study of 6,500 employees at a Holiday Inn, researchers had employees rate their trust in their managers from a scale of 1 to 5. What they found is an eighth of a point increase in trust correlated to a 2.5% increase in revenue, or in dollars, $250,000 increase in revenue per hotel. Now, if you think about that revenue advantage scaled up to an economy, there's a huge impact. In a World Bank study of 29 different market economies, researchers found that a 10% increase in trust in the population correlated with a 0.8% increase in GDP. And so, in fact, when Sandra and I were talking to a CEO in a developing country, he mentioned that he wanted to build a hotel, but because construction workers in that country were prone to taking supplies and not working if watched, he actually had to sleep on the premises of the hotel to make sure that nothing was being stolen and employees did their work. And if you think about the amount this adds to costs and how much it slows down business, you can see why trust is so important. In fact, as the Nobel Prize winning economist Kenneth Arrow once said, virtually every commercial transaction has within itself an element of trust. It can be plausibly argued that much of the economic backwardness in the world can be explained by lack of mutual confidence, or what Sandra and I called trust. I'm going to turn it back over to Sandra now, and she's going to explain on what basis do people trust.
So what you've heard so far is some basic principles of trust, the benefits of it. So let's dig in now to this question about why do people trust anyway? If trust is vulnerability, why am I willing to make myself vulnerable to organizations? We're going to use Uber as an example. At least in the United States, Uber is the company that everyone loves to hate. And what I'm going to explain is why it is that a company can be, on the one hand, competent and still not trusted. So Uber, at least in the United States, literally wrote the book on how it is to be a good ride-hailing company. They created amazing technology to connect customer needs, where the customer is, what destination they're going to, billing, and immediate feedback, all in a format that their drivers could be managing relationships with individual customers throughout the day. So competence is an organization's basic ability to deliver a product or service. And when I say basic, I don't actually mean it's so basic. I was in business for 20 years before I became a professor. And there's nothing basic about being able to create and deliver really great products or services. But if that were all that it took to be trusted, Uber wouldn't actually have the kind of reputation that it does in some of the environments that it operates in. So in addition to competence, it turns out that people trust on three other dimensions. The first of those is motives. And this is a question of whose interest does a company serve. So let me tell you a story. In 2013, an Uber driver in San Francisco ran into a family of four. He killed a little 6-year-old girl, their daughter, injured the mother and her son. And the family then sued Uber in the United States is very litigious, and it would be reasonable to try to ask Uber to be responsible for the actions of its driver. But what Uber did in court is they said, you know what? That driver hadn't picked up his next customer, and he actually hadn't even acknowledged that he had a next customer. So he really wasn't a driver for Uber at that time. So what they tried to claim is that this employee with Uber on his dashboard driving for them was not an Uber driver. So you step back and you say, well, whose interest does this company serve? It's pretty clear that the only interest they care about serving is the interest of Uber, the company. Certainly not the driver, and especially not the family who they had injured in such a grievous way. So we care about competence, we care about motives. We also care about how companies do what they do, their means. And this is largely a question of how fair is the company. So between 2013 and 2015, Uber asked its drivers to book and then cancel rides with their nearest competitor in the US, a company called Lyft. They did this 5,000 times over the course of 1 year, 12 months. And so if you say, is Uber fair in how it does business? This defines unfair competition. This is trying to mess up the on-time reliability of a ride-hailing company by throwing a spanner into the works of its process. So Uber, very competent, motives only out for its own self, means not particularly fair. And then you have a question about what is the actual impact of the results of this company's actions. And so this impact area is quite interesting. This is the impact on I can see it with my own eyes. I don't care what you tell me about it. I know the impact that you've had, and I feel a certain way about that. So I'll tell you a small example of impact from Uber. And for those who work on these issues, it's not so small. So in 2017, there was a reliability engineer, a female reliability engineer, who published a blog post about how she had been sexually harassed at Uber during her period of time there. And during her tenure, reliability engineers in her division dropped from 25% to 6%. She was only there for 2 years. And during that period of time, the environment was so toxic for women engineers at Uber that they were leaving in droves. So now Uber didn't start out to say, let's be a lousy company for women to work for. But the effect of its practices, its support of its really crazy and very sexist CEO meant that it was a very toxic environment for women who work there. So when we say the impact is a result of the company actions, what we're looking for, and we rely on companies to take responsibility for these actions, whether they're intended or unintended. And quite often in business, it's the unintended impacts of our actions that actually get us into trouble when it comes to being trusted. So the bottom line of these 4 dimensions is that trust isn't just one thing. And when you work with your clients, the first thing to help them understand is that competence is the foundation. It's critical to be able to deliver on your company's product or service promise. But after that, there are these other issues in the moral domain, and you're going to be judged on those as well. And so these are the 4 elements on which people are willing to be vulnerable and to allow themselves to trust. So Uber is not a particularly inspiring example of what it is, how trust works in a business. You sort of show, and let me show one last slide, if you don't mind, to show you what the effect of all of this is. So here's, Shalene talked with you about the fact that there are huge benefits to being trusted. Here's the downside. And what you're looking at is a comparison between Uber's market share and its US competitor, Lyft. During the period of time that Uber was in business, it started with about a 90% share of market. And as a result of the way that it did business, it opened up a competitive opening for Lyft, which now owns 32%, a third of the market in the United States, and Uber's dropped down to 2/3. So if you want to ask, is it worth helping your companies learn how to be more trusted? It definitely helps, because otherwise they're going to lose business. So now let me turn it to Shalene for a more optimistic view, the upside of what happens when you are trusted.
This explains to me why I have such mixed feelings about Uber. On the one hand, I hate it, but on the other hand, I still use it. So, one of our favorite examples of what it looks like when a company is trusted is HDFC. So, HDFC stands for Housing Development Finance Corporation, which is an Indian financial service company that has accomplished astounding impacts by keeping in mind that one of its most important stakeholders is actually Indian society at large, rather than trying to make the most money. So in 1977, H.T. Pera founded HDFC to provide loans for people who wanted to buy a house. Now, at the time, India had a huge need for housing. Culturally, the population didn't like going into debt, and there wasn't much infrastructure for loans. Pretty much what was available was government banks, where it could take up to a year in order to get a loan, and the service treated you as if they were doing you a favor when you got money. And what HDFC did is it actually narrowed this time down into 6 weeks to get a loan. Not only that, it earned a reputation for high integrity and customer care because it trained its employees not to accept bribes. Any employee that accepted a bribe was fired. Plus, employees were also trained to be incredibly customer-centric, which was not usual at the time. Unsurprisingly, HDFC had 100% of the private lender market share and was astoundingly successful. So Parrot could have decided, that's great, let's just stay a monopoly. And in fact, many companies in that position probably would have done that. But he actually believed that India had a much larger need for housing than HDFC could meet. So he took this unprecedented step and actually invested up to 20% in 3 other companies. And not only that, helped train the employees and management. Of course, HDFC's market share fell to 75% to 80%, yet its growth remains the same, about 30 to 40% a year. However, today, HDFC's market share has dropped to 19%, yet it's still the biggest mortgage provider in India. And not only that, it has earned an unprecedented amount of trust. Because it took the step of helping the entire industry, the government has actually made HDFC an advisor, and HDFC has had a seat at the table for advising on policy and was brought in as a consultant during the Satyam scandal. Not only that, HDFC was able to capitalize on the trust in its brand to create HDFC Bank, which is India's largest private lender. And so we can see that trust has incredible amounts of benefits that we wouldn't even think about if you go and you actually think about stakeholders that are larger than yourself. I'm going to turn it back over to Sandra now.
Great. So, and I always find that HDFC story just amazing in the sense of the trust that you can get when you invest in the standing of the community as a whole. This is such a powerful platform from which to grow a company, and it's desirable everywhere, and it shows that businesses aren't separate from society. We're actually part of society, and we have a role to play in making society better. So let me turn to our next topic, which is, okay, this is great. We understand trust some. We definitely have a sense of what it looks like with Uber, what it could look like with HDFC. And the question that Shalene and I set out to really understand in this research is, can lost trust be regained? So if there was any statement that's always made about trust in companies, it's that, you know what? Trust is so fragile. It's like a crystal vase. And once you break it, no way of putting those pieces back together. And so our research actually at this point started in 2017 with a Japanese company called Recruit Holdings. So we had come to actually study a slightly different topic in Japan with Recruit. And when we got there, Shalene and I were fascinated by the story of what's called the Recruit scandal in Japan. So the Recruit scandal is so large. It was a shares for favor scandal. where the CEO offered shares of an unlisted subsidiary at very reasonable rates for members of government and other prominent business leaders. And as a result of this, when this was revealed through the media, there was an enormous outcry, and such that the Prime Minister of Japan and his entire cabinet had to resign. This scandal made such an impression in Japan that it's still written about and is a feature of children's textbooks where they can read about the Recruit scandal. And if and when you go to Japan and you say Recruit, quite often what you'll get from someone on the street is scandal, because they think that's actually what you want to talk about. So Recruit at that time, this was in the 1980s, late 1980s, was a company of a certain size. I'll talk about that in a second. Today, surprisingly, Recruit is a $20 billion revenue producing technology and human services firm. It has 50,000 employees worldwide. So if Recruit can come back from a scandal that is so great that the Prime Minister and his cabinet had to resign, lost trust must be able to be recovered. And so then the question is, well, how on earth did they do that? And so it turns out that there's a pattern that companies who need to recover lost trust follow. There are 3 steps to it. And as PR professionals, I would imagine that one of the most prominent roles that you play at times in companies is having to help them over some bump, some issue that they created and that they need to recover from. So here are the 3 steps that Recruit did and that you'd need to work with your clients on. The first is to acknowledge harm and apologize. Because trust is a moral concept, it's a relationship between people of vulnerability. People who are trusting want to know that your company has created harm, and they want you to apologize for that harm. So to this day, you can go on Recruit's website and you can find the story of the 1980 scandal, the Recruit scandal, what they did, how they thought they recovered from it. And it's prominent, it's displayed in a way that anybody who cares about this can find it on their website and read about it. So this is a very visible way of maintaining ownership for the fact that you created harm and you're apologizing for it. So that's the first step. And honestly, this is something that many companies, as you know, are intensely reluctant to do. But because trust is a moral concept based on relationships between people and organizations, acknowledging harm and apologizing for it are really important things to do to start regaining some of that trust that you lost. The second step is you have to hold people accountable. Now, in a way, you could say that Recruit was lucky, fortunate, because the one person who created the scandal was the CEO. So, quote unquote, all they had to do was to let the courts take over, which they did, and their CEO went to jail. This is kind of a far end of what happens in holding people accountable. But many of you will be working in companies where you kind of go, well, wait a minute, no one did anything illegal here. It was bad. And we may even be sued for it, but was not illegal in that sense. So how can our senior leaders themselves regain trust? And there are 2 things that we've seen that seem to make a big difference. The first is whether the CEO, the senior leaders, acknowledge the harm and apologize themselves. And I'm not talking here about one of those mistakes were made, apologies, passive voice, somehow no one made these mistakes. This is a pretty full-throated, here's what we did, here's the way that we know that it's harmful, here's how it happened, and the last part is what's called an offer of repair, and here's what we're doing about it. So the degree to which CEOs are seen as the people who are making the apology, and they're also the people who are leading the effort to try to repair the trust breach, that builds trust back in them. People go, oh, okay, I get it. This person understands this, and they're actually doing something quite concrete to try to take the organization forward and to figure out what went wrong. And that is, in fact, the third part. So in order to recover lost trust, you first have to figure out, well, on what basis did we lose trust? And what led to that problem in the first place? Now, Recruit, the problem was fairly divided up into here's what the CEO did. But they nonetheless then had a different kind of a problem. And their problem had two dimensions to it. The first is that this same CEO had taken out loans that even the senior team were not aware of. And he left the company saddled with a debt that was so large that the carrying costs on the debt exceeded their profit on an annual basis. So they don't have any money really to speak of and have to claw back to profitability, which means they need customers to believe in them again. The second problem that they had was that their workforce was tremendously demoralized. Not only was it a mark of shame to work at Recruit, kids were being bullied on playgrounds and at school because their parents worked at Recruit. And so this was a company that needed to rebuild itself from the inside out. So the conclusion that they drew was that they could no longer do what Japanese companies are famous for, have been, which is offer lifetime employment. What they did decide that they could do is to make people more employable when they leave. And so their strategy is, let's be a good place to be from. So in the near term, what they did is they put the salespeople who worked with their clients back in front of them, and they gave them permission to talk about the scandal, talk about the fact that they weren't personally involved. And they did this very interesting distinction in how they introduced themselves. So in Japan at that time, and it may still be true, you introduce your company first, and then you say your name. And what they decided is that the employees needed to have more of an individual relationship with their clients. And so they decided that the employees, the salespeople, would say their name first, and then the company. It's a pretty subtle distinction to people who don't watch these things. But in their environment, in their culture, it was a genuine way of trying to say, I'm Sandra, and I work at Recruit, rather than Recruit is in the room, and I'm Sandra representing the company. And so that was the first thing. And they actually lost almost no business in the immediate term, because people said, well, that was something that the CEO did. That's pretty bad, but we understand that you're still giving value to us. And then after that, they created some very distinct human resource policies to try to retain staff and make it a good place to be from. The first thing that they do, if you're an employee at Recruit, you are in for a performance appraisal every 6 months. And every 6 months, you're asked to look at 2 time frames. One is, what do you want to do in the next 6 months? And what do you want to do in the next 3 years? And by giving employees that kind of a runway to imagine their future, they do 2 things. One is they can really better match employees to projects that build the skills that the employees want to work on. And the employees understand this is a company that cares about me and that wants to see me grow and flourish. The second thing that they do is that all of the projects that they work on Recruit have some connection to the greater good. Even a project that started off as some way that you could get your hair done started because one of the employees knew someone who thought she was going to have to quit because she had to be in the salon every day because she didn't know when she would get customers. And so he created one of these matching platforms. Here are the people who can do your hair. Here's the when they're available. And then she would be able to go home and take care of her children when she wasn't in the salon. So all of their projects have this connection to human worth, to social worth. And this is very motivating. And this is something that they had done pretty much from the beginning of the organization. The third thing that they do is that they prioritize giving junior people a lot of responsibility. So when in doubt at Recruit, it's passion first. And they go for the person with the most passion, not necessarily the best experience, and they grow that person in the job, and they really grow them. Every time that person goes to talk to a senior leader, what they get asked is, well, what do you think you should do? Which is kind of frustrating, but it makes them much more resilient and autonomous and able to grow their own skills. And the last thing that they do is they set up a very robust program of recognition of accomplishment. So I'm being grown as a company, as an individual. I get to connect my goals to things that matter. I'm being recognized for this. And one of the features of this program is that if you win one of their recognition awards, you have to make the rounds and explain what was your best practice to all the people who do your job in the organization. So this is on the strength of this. This company now, same size as Salesforce, $20 billion in revenues. It actually has 50,000 employees worldwide. And so this is proof paid that you can definitely recover lost trust. It's not easy. And for those of you who are operators, you know all of the difficulties of what I'm describing and what it's like to install those practices and really do them inside an organization. But if you can do those things, you can definitely recover lost trust. So let me try to then pull all of this together. So here's a fairly straightforward view of what we've been talking about. First is trust is our willingness to be vulnerable. And here again, you're helping your companies focus on the vulnerability of the people who rely on them to do business. Right? It's not their vulnerability. It's the vulnerability of their stakeholders to the actions of the company. The second is trust is built using these four elements: competence, motives, means, and impact. The Uber story shows us competence is not enough. If it were, Uber wouldn't have lost a third of its market share. And so you definitely need to be trusted on these other dimensions, and you can be trusted on some of them and not on others. And finally, I think the big story for people in your line of work is that lost trust can be recovered. There are strategies that you can put in place and a process that's pretty reliable for helping your company get over a bump in the road that they put there, that they created. So we strongly, Shalene and I, believe that trust helps businesses be a force for good in their communities and in the world. And if we can help our companies become more trusted, I think they will be able to better do that job of being a force for good in society. So thanks so much. Well, we thank you for your time.
Thank you.